Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You shouldn't even be here. The words landed sharp and cold, cutting through the already suffocating tension in the room like a blade against fragile glass. I turned my head slowly, my eyes meeting my Aunt Linda's smug expression, her lips curled in satisfaction as if she had been waiting all day to say it. My fingers tightened around the damp tissue in my hand, but I didn't respond. Not yet. The weight of grief pressed heavy on my chest, an unbearable force that made my limbs feel sluggish, my mind clouded. My father's casket sat at the front of the room, surrounded by somber-faced mourners who whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting between the closed coffin and the daughter he had apparently been so ashamed of. Linda took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only I could hear, though the venom in her tone still dripped like acid. "You were always his biggest disappointment, you know that, right? The daughter who walked away and never looked back, the one who left him to die alone." A bitter taste filled my mouth, but I swallowed it down, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I had spent years carrying the weight of regret, years wondering if I had made a mistake by keeping my distance from the man who had spent most of his life treating me like a failure. And now, standing in the suffocating silence of the funeral home, the regret felt like it had settled into my bones, turning my body into something heavy and unmovable. People were watching, pretending not to listen but leaning in just enough to catch the pieces of whispered cruelty that Linda so freely offered. I could feel their judgment, their unspoken agreement that I had no right to be here, no right to grieve a man who had spent years barely acknowledging my existence. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I don't need your opinion on what I should or shouldn't be, Linda. He was still my father, no matter what you think." Linda laughed, a short, humorless sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Was he? Because from where I'm standing, he spent most of his life pretending you didn't exist. And now you come crawling back, acting like you cared?" She shook her head, the fake sadness in her eyes almost as infuriating as the words themselves. "It's pathetic, really. You should have just stayed away, saved yourself the embarrassment." A sharp burst of anger flared in my chest, momentarily overpowering the grief, but before I could respond, the voice of the funeral director cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "We will now begin the service," he announced, his calm and practiced tone doing nothing to ease the thick unease that had settled in the air. Linda shot me one last satisfied smirk before turning on her heel, walking towards the front of the room where the rest of the family sat in the first row. I hesitated, my feet planted firmly in place as I debated whether I should even stay. The urge to leave, to turn my back on the whispered accusations and the disapproving glances, was nearly overwhelming. But I couldn't. Not yet. With a deep breath, I forced myself forward, taking a seat towards the back, far away from the people who had already decided I didn't belong here. The eulogy began, filled with carefully chosen words that painted my father as a great man, a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. No one mentioned the way he had barely spoken to me for the last decade, the way he had made it clear that I was never the daughter he wanted. The service dragged on, a blur of prayers and solemn faces, but my mind remained stuck on Linda's words, looping in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. "You were always his biggest disappointment." And maybe she was right. The service ended, and the crowd moved towards the reception area, murmuring among themselves as they picked at small plates of food and sipped on cheap coffee. I stood near the exit, contemplating whether I should slip away unnoticed, disappear before Linda could take another jab at me. But then the lawyer walked in, a thick folder clutched in his hands, his face unreadable as he scanned the room. The conversations around me quieted as people turned to watch him, curiosity lighting their eyes as he cleared his throat. "If I could have everyone's attention, please," he announced, his voice carrying over the low hum of whispered speculation. "Before we depart for the burial, I have been asked to read the final will and testament of Mr. Robert Carter." A ripple of surprise moved through the room, whispers growing louder as people exchanged glances. No one had expected the will to be read today, least of all me. My stomach twisted, the anticipation laced with dread. I glanced towards Linda, whose smug expression faltered just slightly as she crossed her arms over her chest. She was expecting everything, of course, expecting the house, the money, the assets. She had been the golden child, the loyal one, the person who had stayed by his side when I had walked away. The lawyer cleared his throat again, flipping open the folder as he adjusted his glasses. Actually, he began, his voice slow and deliberate. Your father had something to say about that. The room fell into a suffocating silence, the air so thick with tension that I could feel it pressing against my skin. Linda's smirk froze in place, the color draining ever so slightly from her face as she stared at the lawyer. For the first time all day, I felt something other than grief and regret. I felt something that almost resembled hope. The room, already heavy with grief and barely concealed tension, seemed to still completely as the lawyer unfolded the thick stack of papers with a careful precision that made the anticipation unbearable. Every rustle of the document, every slow adjustment of his glasses, felt intentional, as if he understood the weight of what he was about to reveal and wanted to prolong the moment just to watch everyone squirm. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the murmur of voices behind me, the shuffling of feet, the occasional clearing of a throat as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I didn't know what to expect, but I did know one thing for certain. My father had never made me feel like I was anything more than a regret, so whatever was written in that will, it certainly wasn't meant to include me. Linda, still sitting in the front row with her back impossibly straight, exuded the kind of smug confidence that came with years of entitlement, her fingers lightly drumming against the arm of her chair as if she were already celebrating a victory she hadn't yet officially won. She had spent the last decade practically glued to my father's side, controlling every aspect of his life while making sure I stayed far away from it, always slipping in little comments about how I had abandoned him, how I didn't deserve a second chance, how he was better off without me. She had done everything in her power to make sure I remained nothing more than a shadow in my father's story, an afterthought, a mistake that would never be acknowledged. And now, she was simply waiting for the final confirmation of what she had always believed, that she had won and I had lost. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he scanned the first page, his expression carefully neutral. This is the last will and testament of Robert Carter, he began, his voice calm but firm, carrying just enough authority to silence the last few murmuring guests. As per his final wishes, the contents of this will shall be read in the presence of his family, and his decisions are to be carried out without dispute or delay. A slow breath left my lungs, though it did nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. My fingers curled into fists against my lap, nails digging into my palms as I prepared myself for the inevitable confirmation that my father had left me nothing, that my existence had been as insignificant to him in death as it had been in life. The lawyer continued, his voice steady and emotionless. To my sister, Linda Carter, I leave my gratitude for the years she has spent overseeing my affairs and ensuring my comfort during my final days. I acknowledge her unwavering presence and her dedication to my well-being. I could feel Linda straightening, her shoulders lifting slightly as she basked in the recognition, a self-satisfied smirk creeping onto her lips. But then, the lawyer's tone shifted slightly, a subtle but noticeable change in cadence as he moved to the next portion of the will, his fingers tightening around the edge of the paper. However, he said, pausing just long enough to send a ripple of unease through the room, I have come to recognize that presence does not always equate to loyalty, and devotion does not always come without ulterior motives. The smirk on Linda's lips froze, her fingers stiffening against the chair's armrest as a murmur of confusion spread through the crowd. The lawyer barely glanced up as he pressed forward, his words precise, measured, and entirely unrelenting. To my beloved daughter, Emily Carter, I leave not only my estate, including all properties, financial assets, and personal belongings, but also the truth she deserves to know. A stunned silence fell over the room, a silence so complete that for a brief moment, I wasn't even sure if I had heard him correctly. The words felt foreign, impossible, as if they belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had lived a life completely different from mine, a life where they had been loved, valued, chosen. My breath caught in my throat, and I barely registered the collective gasps, the sharp inhales, the rustling of fabric as people turned in their seats, their eyes darting between me and Linda, waiting for the inevitable explosion that was sure to follow. Linda's complexion had gone from smugly confident to alarmingly pale in a matter of seconds, her knuckles white as she gripped the chair like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, as if she were trying to form a response, trying to grasp onto some kind of logical explanation for what had just happened. The lawyer continued as if completely unaware of the mounting tension, flipping to the next page without hesitation. It has taken me years to realize that the distance between my daughter and me was not of her own making, he read, his voice carrying an edge of something deeper now, something more personal, as if the words themselves carried the weight of a long-buried truth. I was led to believe things about her that were never true, convinced by those I trusted most that she had abandoned me, that she did not care, that she did not wish to be part of my life. But I have come to understand, too late, that I was wrong, and that the greatest mistake of my life was allowing that lie to shape my relationship with my only child. A sharp inhale from Linda, barely audible but deafening in the stunned silence, was the only sign of her unraveling composure. My heartbeat roared in my ears, my vision narrowing as the words settled deep into my bones, as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. My father, my cold, distant, unreachable father, had known the truth after all this time. He had known. The lawyer set the document down for a moment, glancing up for the first time since he had begun reading, his gaze landing on me with something almost resembling sympathy. "There's a letter addressed to you, Miss Carter," he said, reaching into the folder and pulling out a single, carefully sealed envelope. "Your father wrote it before his passing, and he requested that you read it privately." My fingers trembled as I reached for it, my entire body numb with disbelief, with something dangerously close to hope. Across the room, Linda was still frozen in place, her face an unreadable mask of shock and barely contained rage. I clutched the letter tightly in my hands, knowing without even opening it that everything I had believed, everything I had been told, had been a lie. And for the first time in years, I was finally going to know the truth. The letter felt heavier in my hands than it should have, as though the weight of years of silence, misunderstanding, and resentment had been pressed into its thin paper, making it almost unbearable to hold. My fingers trembled slightly as I traced the edges of the envelope, my breath coming uneven as the enormity of the moment settled into my chest like an iron weight. I had spent years wondering why my father had pushed me away, years convincing myself that I had been the problem, that something about me had never been enough for him, that no matter how hard I had tried to make him proud, I had only ever been a source of disappointment. And now, in this single piece of paper, I held the truth, the real truth that had been hidden from me all along. The room was still eerily quiet, the air thick with the kind of tension that made the skin prickle and the throat tighten. I could feel the weight of every set of eyes on me, some filled with curiosity, others with pity, and at least one pair burning with barely concealed rage. Linda hadn't moved since the moment the lawyer had uttered the words that had shattered her carefully constructed reality, but I could feel the storm brewing beneath her stiff posture, the way her fingers twitched slightly against her lap, the way her jaw clenched tighter with every passing second that I stood there holding something she had never wanted me to have. Swallowing hard, I tore open the envelope with unsteady hands, my heartbeat drumming so loudly in my ears that I barely registered the hushed whispers around me. The letter was written in my father's unmistakable handwriting, the ink slightly smudged in places, as though his hands had shaken while writing it, as though he had been burdened with the weight of what he was finally confessing. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes skimmed the first few lines, my fingers tightening around the paper as the words sank in, one after another, shattering every lie I had ever been told. "My dearest Emily," it began, the words almost foreign to me, as though I were reading something meant for someone else, someone who had been loved openly and unconditionally, rather than a daughter who had spent her life feeling like an afterthought. I do not know if you will ever truly forgive me, and I would not blame you if you never did. I have made many mistakes in my life, but the greatest of them all was believing the lies I was told about you, the lies that kept me from seeing you for who you truly are. I let the wrong person whisper in my ear, poison my thoughts, and convince me that you did not love me, that you wanted nothing to do with me, that I was nothing more than a burden you had left behind. I let those words shape my view of you, and for that, I will never forgive myself. My vision blurred slightly as the edges of my father's words softened, my chest tightening with something dangerously close to sorrow, but also with something I hadn't expected, anger. Not just at him, not just at the years I had lost believing I had been unwanted, but at the person who had stolen those years from me. The person who had stood between us and carefully orchestrated our estrangement like a master manipulator pulling the strings of a carefully crafted illusion. I see it now, but it is far too late. The truth is, you were never the disappointment I made you believe you were. You were never the failure I so cruelly painted you to be. You were my daughter, my only child, and the only mistake you ever made was trusting that I would see through the lies before it was too late. And I should have known better, should have looked deeper, should have questioned why someone was so desperate to make me believe that my own flesh and blood wanted nothing to do with me. A sharp, shuddering breath left my lips, my grip on the letter tightening as I felt the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed suddenly clicking into place, forming a picture that was so clear, so painfully obvious, that I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it before. And when I lifted my gaze, locking eyes with Linda, I knew, she knew. Her face was a carefully constructed mask of forced indifference, but I could see the cracks forming beneath the surface, the way her chest rose and fell just a little too quickly, the way her eyes darted between me and the letter as though she could will it to disappear, as though she could somehow undo what had just been revealed with sheer force of will. You knew, didn't you? The words left my lips before I had even fully processed them, my voice quiet but razor-sharp, slicing through the tense silence with an edge that made even the lawyer shift uncomfortably in his seat. Linda's fingers twitched against her lap, her lips parting slightly as if to deny it, as if to summon one last, desperate lie that could salvage what was left of her illusion. But it was too late. I could see it in the way her breath hitched, in the way her entire body tensed like a cornered animal preparing to lash out. And then, as if she had finally lost whatever control she had been desperately clinging to, she lunged. Her hands shot out toward the letter, fingers clawing for the damning piece of paper as though destroying it could somehow erase the truth, as though ripping it from my grasp would be enough to turn back time and keep her secrets buried where they belonged. But I was faster. I yanked the letter back just in time, the paper crumpling slightly in my grip as I took a quick step backward, my heart pounding wildly in my chest as Linda stumbled forward, her face twisting into something furious and unrecognizable. You were supposed to stay gone, she spat, her voice low and trembling with barely restrained rage, her carefully cultivated composure crumbling to dust before my eyes. You were supposed to be out of the way, forgotten. He wasn't supposed to change his mind. And just like that, the final piece fell into place. I stared at her, at the woman who had spent years making me feel small, making me believe that I had been the one to walk away when all along it had been her keeping me away. My breath came slow and steady now, the anger settling into something calmer, something sharper, something that wasn't going to let her get away with this anymore. Too bad, I said quietly, watching as her eyes darkened with something almost like fear. Because I'm still here. And I'm not going anywhere. The room was suffocatingly silent except for the rapid beating of my own heart, a steady rhythm of disbelief, anger, and something deeper that I hadn't yet put a name to, something heavy that settled into my chest like a weight that would never fully lift. Linda stood just a few feet away, her shoulders tense, her fingers curled into tight fists at her sides, her face a storm of unreadable emotions that shifted too quickly for me to grasp. She had always been so careful, so composed, always in control of every situation she stepped into, but now, with my father's words still hanging in the air between us and the truth pressing down on her like an anvil, I could see the cracks forming in the mask she had spent years perfecting. I stepped forward, gripping the letter tightly in my hand, my knuckles white with the force of it, my voice steady despite the rage simmering just beneath my skin. "Tell me why," I said, my words slow, deliberate, edged with something sharp and unyielding. "Tell me why you did it, why you went out of your way to turn him against me, why you made him believe I didn't love him when you knew that wasn't true." Linda's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard, as if searching for something to say, some last-minute lie that could salvage whatever was left of the twisted reality she had created. But I wasn't going to let her slip away this time, wasn't going to let her weave another story, wasn't going to let her manipulate her way out of the truth that was finally staring her in the face. "You told him I abandoned him," I continued, my voice unwavering despite the storm raging inside me. "You told him I didn't care, that I wanted nothing to do with him, that I had moved on without a second thought. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? You had to make sure there was no way for him to find out otherwise, no way for him to hear the truth from me. You stole my letters, didn't you?" Linda's body went rigid at the accusation, her lips pressing together in a thin, bloodless line, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something flicker across her face that I had never seen before: fear. It was quick, barely there for more than a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew, enough to make my pulse hammer with the realization that I had finally backed her into a corner she couldn't escape from. I turned to the lawyer, who was still standing beside me, his expression carefully neutral but his posture tense, as though he were bracing for whatever was about to come next. "Tell her," I said, barely glancing at him as I kept my eyes locked on Linda's. "Tell her what you found." The lawyer cleared his throat, flipping open a folder he had been holding since the moment he stepped into the room, his fingers gliding across the pages until he reached the one he was looking for. His voice was calm, professional, but there was an unmistakable edge of finality to it as he began reading. "During the review of Mr. Carter's estate, we discovered a collection of letters that had been addressed to him but never opened. These letters were found in a locked drawer in Miss Linda Carter's personal study, stored away with no intention of ever being delivered. All of them were written by Emily Carter over the course of 10 years, each one expressing a desire to mend their relationship, each one an attempt to reach out, to reconnect, to find a way back to the father-daughter bond that had been broken. Mr. Carter never received a single one. The air in the room felt too thick, too heavy, pressing down on me like a crushing force, but I refused to let it break me, refused to let the sheer magnitude of what had just been revealed pull me under. The truth was out now, the truth that Linda had worked so hard to bury, and there was no taking it back, no rewriting it, no twisting it into something else. I stared at her, waiting, giving her one last chance to explain herself, to say something, anything, to justify what she had done, but she remained silent, her face pale, her eyes flickering with something that almost resembled desperation. "Why?" I asked again, my voice barely more than a whisper now, but it cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and precise. "Why would you do something like that? What did you get out of it? What was so important to you that you were willing to destroy my relationship with my father just to keep it?" Linda let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound brittle and sharp, like broken glass scraping against concrete. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice trembling just slightly, her hands shaking as she finally lifted her gaze to meet mine. "You always had his love, whether you realized it or not. He may not have shown it the way you wanted, but it was always there, always in the way he talked about you, always in the way he worried about you, always in the way he tried to pretend he didn't miss you when everyone could see that he did." She took a step closer, her eyes dark with something that I couldn't quite place, something raw and ugly and twisted. "But me? I was nothing to him. I was just his sister, just the person he tolerated, the one he relied on when it was convenient, but never really cared about. No matter what I did, no matter how much time I spent by his side, no matter how much I sacrificed for him, he never looked at me the way he looked at you, never saw me as anything more than background noise in his life. And the worst part? He knew it. He knew that he would never love me the way he loved you, so when it came time to write his will, he made sure I got nothing. Her voice broke on the last word, her composure finally shattering completely, and in that moment, I saw her for what she truly was, not the powerful, controlling woman I had spent my entire life fearing, but a bitter, jealous, desperate person who had spent years trying to steal something that had never belonged to her in the first place. "You destroyed my relationship with my father because you were jealous?" I asked, the disbelief thick in my voice, the rage bubbling up so fiercely that I could barely breathe. "You took away years that I will never get back because you couldn't stand the fact that he loved me?" Linda's face twisted into something furious, something desperate, and before I even had time to react, she lunged. Her hands reached for me, her movements wild and unhinged, but this time I didn't flinch, didn't shrink away, didn't let the fear take hold of me the way it always had before. This time, I stood my ground. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Linda's fingers twitched as she stood frozen in place, her face an unreadable mask of fury, disbelief, and something bordering on desperation, as if the sheer force of her rage alone could undo everything that had just unfolded. I could see the frantic calculations flashing behind her eyes, the silent struggle to regain control of the situation, to find some loophole, some way out, some last shred of authority she could cling to before everything slipped through her fingers forever. But there was nothing left for her to manipulate, no more lies to tell, no more letters to hide, no more bridges to burn. Her game was over, and the only thing left was the reality she had tried so hard to avoid. I took a slow step forward, my breath even, my hands steady, my pulse no longer hammering with the kind of fear that she had spent years instilling in me, the kind of fear that had kept me silent, kept me doubting myself, kept me believing that I was never enough. That fear was gone now, replaced with something much colder, much sharper, something that didn't tremble under the weight of her presence, but stood tall in the face of her downfall. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to her, I was leading this moment, I was in control, and she knew it just as well as I did. A smirk tugged at the corner of my lips as I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against the envelope that had been waiting for this exact moment, the envelope that held the final blow. The one that would take the last remnants of power from Linda's grasp and leave her with nothing but the consequences of her own actions. I pulled it out slowly, deliberately, letting her see it, letting the anticipation build, watching as her eyes flickered with the briefest flash of confusion before settling into something colder, something dangerously close to denial. "This is for you," I said, my voice calm, steady, entirely devoid of the hesitation that had once defined every interaction between us. I extended the envelope toward her, my grip firm, unwavering, refusing to flinch even as she hesitated before snatching it from my hand with more force than necessary, her nails nearly slicing through the paper as she gripped it too tightly. Linda's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as she ripped the envelope open, her hands trembling slightly, whether from rage or fear. I wasn't entirely sure, but it didn't matter. Nothing she did now could change what was written inside. Her eyes darted across the page, scanning the words, absorbing the reality of what she was seeing, and with every passing second, the color drained further from her face, her lips parting slightly as if she had forgotten how to breathe. A heavy silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders as the truth finally settled in, as the last piece of her carefully constructed world came crumbling down around her, leaving her with nothing but the ruins of her own making. She blinked once, then twice, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her fingers tightening around the paper until it crinkled under the pressure, as if she could crush the words into nothingness, as if she could erase them simply by refusing to accept them. This isn't real," she whispered finally, her voice barely more than a breath, a hollow, broken sound that carried none of the venom, none of the authority, none of the condescension that had always been her greatest weapon. "This can't be real." "Oh, it's very real," I replied smoothly, my arms crossing over my chest as I watched the cracks in her composure widen, watched as she began to realize there was no escape, no way to twist this into something that worked in her favor. That's a formal eviction notice, courtesy of my father's final wishes. As of today, this house, every dollar in his accounts, every piece of property he ever owned, it's all mine now. And as per his explicit instructions, you have exactly 24 hours to pack your things and leave. Linda let out a sharp, choked laugh, one that was entirely devoid of humor, one that was laced with something far more desperate, far more dangerous, a sound that bordered on hysteria as she shook her head wildly, as if doing so would somehow undo what had already been set into motion. "He wouldn't do this to me," she hissed, her voice rising now, growing more erratic with every word. "He wouldn't just throw me out like I'm nothing. He needed me. He relied on me. I was the only one who was ever there for him." I tilted my head slightly, watching her unravel, watching as years of manipulation, of scheming, of carefully orchestrated deceit came crashing down in real time, and for the first time, I saw her exactly for what she was, not the untouchable, all-powerful force I had once feared, but a woman who had built her entire existence on a foundation of lies, a woman who had spent so long weaving false narratives that she had started to believe them herself. And now, faced with the cold, inescapable truth, she had nothing left to hold on to. "Maybe that's what you told yourself," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less cutting, no less final. "But in the end, he saw through you, Linda. He saw what you did, he saw what you took from me, and he made sure you would never be able to do it again." The lawyer, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat then, stepping forward slightly as if to drive the final nail into Linda's coffin. Per Mr. Carter's explicit instructions, he stated, his tone measured and professional, but carrying an undeniable weight of finality, Linda Carter is to be removed from the property within 24 hours. There will be no negotiations, no delays, and no further discussions regarding the matter. The legal documents have already been processed, and law enforcement will be called if there is any attempt to contest this order. The words hit Linda like a physical blow, her body swaying slightly, her knees nearly buckling as she stumbled backward, collapsing into the nearest chair as if the very foundation beneath her feet had been ripped away. She stared blankly at the paper in her hands, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps, her mind clearly struggling to process the reality that she had spent her entire life avoiding, that she had finally lost. I took a slow step closer, leaning in just slightly, my voice dropping to a quiet murmur, just loud enough for her to hear. "I spent years believing I had nothing," I whispered, my tone calm, unwavering, laced with the quiet satisfaction of long overdue justice. "And now, you know exactly how that feels." I straightened, stepping back as Linda remained motionless, her entire world crumbling around her, her mind racing for an escape that no longer existed. The power she had once wielded over me was gone, reduced to nothing more than a shadow of a past that no longer held any weight, and as I turned away, leaving her to sit in the wreckage of her own making, I knew without a doubt, this was the moment I had been waiting for. And I had won. The wind was cold against my skin as I stood in front of the gravestone, my fingers lightly tracing the carved letters of my father's name, feeling the rough edges beneath my fingertips, as if trying to make sense of everything that had led me to this exact moment. The cemetery was quiet, aside from the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird too oblivious to the weight of human grief, too indifferent to the fact that, standing here, I was saying goodbye in a way I had never truly been able to do before. The guilt that had once wrapped itself around my heart, suffocating and relentless, had finally loosened its grip, retreating into something softer, something quieter, something that no longer burned every time I thought of him. For so many years, I had convinced myself that I had been the cause of our distance, that I had been the one who had failed to be enough, that I had been the one who had chosen to walk away when, in truth, the choice had never been mine to make. I had been robbed of the chance to have a real relationship with my father, robbed of the opportunity to know him as more than just a figure in the background of my life, robbed of moments that had been stolen before I even had the chance to reach for them. But standing here now, I knew that despite everything, despite the years of silence and the pain that had shaped so much of my existence, he had loved me in his own way, even if he had realized it too late. A slow breath left my lips as I knelt beside the grave, pressing my palm flat against the cool stone, the final barrier between us, the last tangible connection to a man I had spent my entire life trying to understand. "I know now that you loved me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the gentle rustling of the wind, my words carrying the weight of all the things I had never been able to say. "And I forgive you." The words felt lighter than I expected, less like an obligation and more like a release, like something I had needed to say not just for him, but for myself, for the girl I had once been, for the woman I had become. I didn't need his approval anymore, didn't need to chase after something that had been kept out of my reach for so long, didn't need to prove anything to anyone, not even to the ghost of a man who had spent his final years trapped in a lie that someone else had fed him. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle into my bones, letting the weight of it become something manageable, something I could carry without it breaking me. Then, without another word, I stood, brushing the dirt from my knees, my gaze lingering on the gravestone for just a moment longer before I turned away, knowing that this time, when I walked away, it wouldn't be because I had been pushed. It would be because I was finally free to leave on my own terms. As I made my way back toward the entrance of the cemetery, my eyes caught a familiar figure in the distance, hunched over, surrounded by suitcases and boxes, her movements jerky and frantic, her entire body radiating the kind of desperation that came only when a person realized they had lost everything and had no one left to blame but themselves. Linda was packing the last of her belongings into an old, beat-up car that wasn't hers, stuffing clothes into bags with none of the grace or elegance she had once prided herself on, her face twisted into something hollow and tired, something bitter and broken. For years, she had held herself above me, looking down at me as if I were nothing, as if I were the one who had failed, the one who had lost. But now, as she stood there, with nowhere to go and nothing left to hold on to, it was clear that she had never really won anything at all. She had spent her entire life trying to control everything around her, twisting people's perceptions, manipulating the truth, holding onto power with an iron grip, and yet, in the end, it had all slipped through her fingers like sand, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of her own making. She must have felt my gaze on her because she looked up suddenly, her eyes locking onto mine, and for a split second, something flickered in her expression, something that might have once been defiance but was now laced with something weaker, something she would never admit to regret. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of acknowledging it, didn't waste another breath on her, didn't need to say anything at all, because there was nothing left to say. She had made her choices, and now, for the first time, she was the one who had to live with them. I turned away, stepping through the cemetery gates without looking back, without second-guessing, without hesitation. The past no longer had a hold on me, the ghosts of old wounds no longer whispered in my ears, the weight of guilt and resentment no longer shackled me to a version of myself that had spent too long searching for answers she would never find. I had my truth now, and that was enough. As I walked down the quiet, tree-lined street, the cool autumn air brushing against my skin, a thought crept into my mind, uninvited but persistent, lingering like a shadow in the back of my consciousness. What if I had known the truth sooner? The question curled around me, soft and bittersweet, but I didn't let it take root, didn't let it become something that would haunt me the way so many other questions had. Maybe things would have been different, maybe not, but none of it mattered now, because this was where I was meant to be, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, free.